The morning heat settled over the frontier town like a verdict, pressing grit into skin and conscience alike. Clarabel stood at the center of the square, with iron around her wrists and her chin lifted, a big-bodied woman whose shadow cut a clean line across the dust. Eli Thompson finished his business with a scratch of ink and the hollow smile of a man who believed signatures could turn people into property. Boone Parter spat in the dirt and tugged the brim of his worn hat lower, as if shade could hide the bitterness that shaped his features. Eyes gathered and weighed the scene. Pity from a few, curiosity from more, indifference from most. Sadie Quinn, the storekeeper, lingered under the awning of her shop, a ledger in one hand, a knot of worry in the other. She had seen exchanges like this so often, the town might as well have paved its main street with them. Yet Clarabel's poise worked under her skin like a splinter she could not ignore. Boone jerked his chin, expecting the woman to fall in behind him like a haltered mule. Clarabel did not move. She held his stare, steady, measuring, unhurried, until uncertainty, thin and unfamiliar, nicked at his temper. The papers said the matter was settled. Her gaze said otherwise. Then, with a controlled breath, she stepped forward. The chains clinked once, a small sound swallowed by the larger hush of onlookers pretending nothing was happening. They took the North Road out of town, where scrub and sky ran on without apology. Carter Ranch rose from the heat shimmer in a collection of exhausted structures. A house holding itself together with habit, a sagging barn, fences that leaned as if whispering to the horizon, and a corral with 3 horses whose ribs showed the cost of a long summer. Clarabel's eyes moved across the place like a surveyor's, noting what was sound, what was failing, and what belonged to neglect rather than poverty. Boone led her to a small shed behind the house and kicked the door inward. "You sleep here." The authority in his voice tried to land like a hammer, it landed like a spoon. The shed was barely a room, gapped plank walls, a roof that admitted daylight and would welcome rain, a dirt floor beaten into hardpan. One foul blanket slumped in a corner. Clarabel crossed the threshold, palms trailing along the boards, feeling for rot and flecks. She lifted her eyes to the roof, counting missing slats. When she spoke, it sounded like the beginning of a work list. "I will need tools." Boone laughed without warmth. "You think you're in a position to ask?" "I am in a position to produce results," she answered, turning toward him. "With proper shelter, food, and equipment, I can work effectively. Without those, you will pay in waste and sickness. Choose the outcome you prefer." He expected pleading or fear, not options. The emptiness behind his next threat embarrassed him. "You'll take what you get and be grateful." She nodded once, as if he had picked from a menu that included consequence. "Very well. When the work fails, remember who selected failure." She lowered herself onto the blanket with deliberate poise, as if testing a chair in a parlor rather than dirt in a drafty shack. Her wrists rested in her lap, the chains draped like a prop that no longer controlled the scene. Dusk fell in copper bands across the yard. Boone sat on the porch with a bottle, watching the shed the way a dog watches thunder, edgy, pretending indifference. A small glow flared inside as Clarabel kindled a careful fire, smoke threading out through the roof's gaps. Then came a rhythm that did not belong to nighttime. Tap, tap, tap. He stood and squinted into shadow. She had found a rusted hammer, a tin of bent nails, and a pair of loose boards from the broken fence line. By firelight, she began to close the wall's worst gaps, bracing slats with an economy of movement that wasted neither effort nor hope. The sound got under Boone's skin. He had counted on tears or bargains or the defeat that makes a person small. Instead, he heard improvement announcing itself one nail at a time. She did not ask permission to alter what was broken. She simply moved from problem to solution, the way water finds a channel and insists on going forward. When the moon lifted, the shed silhouette looked truer than it had at dusk. Not perfect, not even good, but better. Enough to hold heat, enough to keep wind honest. Clarabel emerged and crossed to the corral, checking the horses with a quiet hand. One bay favored his left foreleg. She paused there longest, studying the swelling, then returned to the shed to tear the blanket lengthwise, fashioning a rough bandage from the cleaner half. She worked with the composure of someone who had learned that indecision is a luxury people like her are never offered. From the porch, Boone searched for anger and found something more complicated. The bottle's comfort dulled it, but not enough to stop a thought from forming. If power meant getting your way by force, then why did everything that mattered here seem to be moving according to her decisions, not his? He told himself morning would return things to their rightful order. The steady, sensible tapping had suggested otherwise, and now the tidy bandage on his horse's leg agreed. Near midnight, coyotes sang on a distant ridge. The ranch settled into the sort of quiet that keeps score. Clarabel lay on her side on the dirt floor, a folded strip of blanket serving as a pillow, her hands relaxed, her expression untroubled. The chains around her wrists had shifted on their own, the links loose enough to rattle when she breathed, tight enough to bruise. She looked like a woman resting between tasks, not a captive waiting for mercy. Boone stared into the dark, listening to a house he had stopped hearing long ago. Loose shutters, a rope creak, the slow click of cooling iron by the cook stove. He had built his life on the belief that control was something you took and held. Here, in the space of an evening, a stranger had demonstrated that control also looked like competence, like calm, like the refusal to accept a broken thing as permanent. Sleep took him late and without comfort. Clarabel rose before dawn, as the sky thinned to gray. By the time the first light laid itself across the corral, she was already standing with the bay, palm on the animal's neck, breath matching breath. The day would have its say soon. She intended to answer it with work. Dawn bled into the yard in a narrow strip of gray, the kind that makes edges look sharper than they are. Clarabel was already standing at the corral, palm flat on the bay's neck, feeling for breath and temper. The horse rolled an anxious eye and shifted weight off his swollen foreleg. She waited him out, breath for breath, until the tremor in his shoulder eased. Her wrists were bare now. Sometime after midnight, while coyotes called and the house ticked as it cooled, she had slipped a sliver of bent nail between shackle and lock and worried it like a problem with an answer. A blacksmith long ago had shown her how most locks are arrogant rather than clever. Arrogance leaves room. Boone lurched out of the house with sleep in his eyes and whiskey crowding his tongue. He came ready to bark. The sight of her unchained paused the words behind his teeth. He glanced at the corral rails, then her hands, then the ground, as if the missing iron might be hiding in the dust to make a fool of him. "Back off that horse," he snapped, grabbing at authority the way a man grabs for a hat on a windy day. "He'll bite." "He hurts," Clarabel said without looking up. Her fingers traced the heat and ridge of the bay's fetlock. "If we don't draw this infection and keep him calm, you'll lose him before week's end." The horse, notorious for bad manners, let her touch the tender place and only twitched. Boone started to tell her she had no leaf to handle his stock. What came out instead was a thin, unconvincing, "You don't touch my animals without permission." "When the gelding founders and you're short another horse, remember that choice belonged to you," she answered. Not sharp, not soft, just finished. She tore a strip from last night's blanket salvage, rinsed it in the water bucket, and tied a temporary wrap that would at least stop the rubbing. The bay blew, ears loose now, and nosed her shoulder like a truce. She moved through the yard with the quiet decision-making of someone who has learned that time spent asking is time lost fixing. She stacked what lumber could still hold a nail, swept broken glass out of the barn aisle, set a coil of rope where it could be reached with one hand. She checked the well cover, found it cracked, and propped it safely. Boone drifted in her wake, scowling at each improvement because scowling was easier to admit than relief. By full morning, the heat woke properly. Flies discovered the yard the way gossip discovers a secret. Clarabel boiled a pot of water on the cook stove without asking, crushed a handful of wild onion she'd foraged near the creek the night before, and added it with garlic from Sadie's last delivery to make a draw poultice. Boone hovered at the edge of the kitchen, as if proximity might teach him something without obligating him to say so. "Where'd you learn that mess?" he asked at last. "My father doctored animals before he was drafted to patch men," she said, stirring. "Infection doesn't care whose blood it rides." He didn't have a reply that didn't sound like a complaint, so he took refuge in silence. When she stepped back into the yard, he followed, carrying the clean water without being told, a concession so small it could be mistaken for habit. She spoke to the bay as she unwrapped the makeshift bandage. The animal's ears tracked her voice, and the worried roll of his eye smoothed into attention. Clarabel spread the warm poultice over the swollen flesh and wound the clean cloth in a steady, even wrap. "Twice a day," she said. "Keep him shaded. No hard work. Oats and quiet." Boone nodded before he thought to argue. The nod surprised them both. By late morning she had the north fence braced with scavenged posts and the tool rack reordered, saws teeth down, chisels wrapped so they wouldn't nick themselves dull. Boone watched a shed transform from a hole in the property to a space that might belong to a plan. The change made the rest of the yard look worse by comparison, which he resented and welcomed in equal measure. "What are you preparing for?" he muttered, not sure whether he meant the yard or himself. "For work to count," she said, "for trouble to come." He scoffed out of habit, and then fell quiet. Trouble obliged him sooner than he expected. Dust began to lift on the road from town, not wind-made, but horses-made. 3 riders, the line and speed of them practiced. Clarabel saw them first and did not change pace. She tamped the last of the fence post, set the mallet down where she could find it again, and wiped her palms on her skirt. Boone shaded his eyes. The cut of the men was familiar. Frank Wallace in the center, all straight spine and borrowed importance. Jake with the slouch of a man who enjoys escalation. Tom hanging back, still learning how to wear his meanness. They pulled up just outside the yard with the easy insolence of men who liked being watched. Frank didn't dismount. He looked past Boone to the woman by the corral like a trader evaluating stock. "Heard you got yourself new help," he called. "Figured we'd come see." "Not for sale," Boone said. The answer came out clean, as if it had been waiting in him for years. Jake grinned, mean without mirth. "Everything's for sale if you have the right price and the wrong conscience." He swung down and started toward Clarabel, hands loose at his sides in that casual way men use when they plan to be anything but. Clarabel faced him with the same measured stillness she'd given the bay, ready to move, not eager to. Her gaze held his without challenge and without apology. The mallet sat 3 steps behind her. She didn't look at it. Her stance said she wouldn't need to reach. "That's close enough," she said. "And if I keep walking?" Jake asked, liking the sound of his own question. "Then you'll learn something about yourself you won't enjoy learning, and something about me you should have respected to begin with." Frank pushed his horse forward a pace, eyes on Boone.
"Your property's making threats," Boone replied, surprising himself again. "You'd do well to read it," Jake replied, finishing the concept. Jake's grin thinned. He was good at spotting weakness. He wasn't used to finding it absent. Clarabel's hands were empty, but nothing about her looked unarmed. Tom shifted in the saddle, glancing at the bay's wrapped leg, the orderly tool rack, the swept barn threshold. This yard had changed since they last rode by. He couldn't say how, only that the air felt less available to them. "Another day," Frank said finally, voice hardening over his own second thoughts. He tugged his reins, as if the retreat were strategy rather than prudence. "We'll talk when you remember your place." "I know mine," Clarabel said, not raising her voice. "You keep forgetting yours when you cross other people's fences." They wheeled and left, dust climbing to erase their shapes. The yard exhaled the breath it had been holding. Boone stood very still, as if moving might break whatever had just been said in him. "You shouldn't have," he began, and stopped, because the rest of the sentence wanted to thank her, and he didn't yet know how to do that without knocking something over. "I did what was necessary," she said. "We should set water troughs where they make sense for animals and for cover. Also a bell line between porch and shed. If riders split, we'll need to speak without shouting." He stared at her as if she'd started reading thoughts off a page only she could see. Then he nodded, the second time today, and easier than the first. He picked up one end of the heavy trough without being told. By evening, 2 troughs sat where they would slow a straight rush, and a thin wire ran from porch post to shed rafters with a tin spoon strung in the middle to sing at a tug. The bay dozed under shade, bandage clean and snug. Clarabel poured a pan of water over her hands, rubbed away the day's grit, and hung the old shackles on a nail by the shed door. They clinked in the cooling air. No longer a threat, not yet a memory. Exactly the kind of lesson she kept close. Boone watched her hang the iron, and felt something rearrange itself behind his ribs. Morning had begun with a man and his property. Evening settled with 2 people on the same ground and a yard that looked a fraction more ready for what might come next.
Morning came sharp and bright, the kind that makes a place either honest or exposed. Clarabel stepped out with her sleeves rolled, eyes already taking the measure of the yard. The bell wire between porch and shed gave a soft, testing tremble when she tugged it. The tin spoon chimed, thin and clear. Boone answered the sound by stepping onto the porch with a bucket and a question lodged behind his teeth. He set the bucket down without asking it. The bay lifted his head at her approach. Heat had left the swollen leg. Angry red had faded to a disciplined pink. Clarabel checked the wrap, felt for hidden fever, and let her breath slow until the horse mirrored it. "He'll keep his leg," she said. Boone nodded, the relief visible, then turned away as if to hide that it mattered. They worked without fuss. Clarabel dragged the wagon to a 30-degree angle against the porch corner, creating a blind where a straight shot would have been. Boone blocked the wheel with a rock as heavy as his old habits. She hauled 2 water troughs to the outer yard, one near the well, one beside the corral, placing them so their bulk would break a mounted charge and serve as stout cover if talk failed. Boone fetched the shovel and followed her nods, cutting shallow trenches to seat the troughs steady. "Why there?" he asked once, chin flicking toward the far trough. "Crossfire," she said. "And if a horse balks at water, men think twice about pressing. Give them time to choose the easier mistake." He considered that, then grunted, which was as near to praise as he knew how to come. Inside the barn, Clarabel climbed the ladder to the loft and cleared a narrow lane along the front edge, sweeping husks and old rope into neat piles. She stacked a crate of river stones where a steady hand could use them to turn arrogance into retreat. Boone peered up from below, eyebrows pulled together. "We throwing rocks now?" "Stones are quiet," she said. "They don't miss often, and they don't make you explain a body." He accepted the logic with a sober nod. Violence used to be a language he mistook for fluency. Lately, he had begun to hear the grammar underneath it. Near noon, a dust plume rose from the road to town. Sadie Quinn's wagon led 2 women on horseback, Martha the baker and Ruth with the neat hands of a seamstress who could stitch flesh if asked. They brought sacks and bundles, salt pork, lamp oil, rags boiled clean, dried herbs, a tin of buttons that had nothing to do with defense and everything to do with reminding a place it was still a home. "We heard about yesterday," Sadie said, eyes moving over the yard's new geometry. "Brought what we could spare and what we think you'll need." Clarabel accepted the supplies like signed contracts. "Thank you," she said, the words simple as a handshake. Boone stood a pace behind, uncomfortable in his own gratitude, unsure where to set it down. Martha's gaze paused on the hanging shackles by the shed door. "Leave them there?" she asked. "For now," Clarabel said. "People should see what ideas look like when they rust." Ruth offered a coil of stout thread and a packet of needles, for harness and for skin, if it comes to that. "We'll do our best to keep it from that," Clarabel replied. She didn't promise. She didn't apologize for the world's habits either. The women stayed long enough to drink water in the shade and hear the bell wire hum when Boone tugged it. "Clever," Sadie said. "Noise that belongs to you." They rolled out with quick nods and a last look that said, "We'll talk if talking helps, we'll stand if standing's needed." The yard felt larger once they left, as if the lines Clarabel had drawn with trough and wagon and wire now extended all the way to town. Afternoon heat lay over everything like a hand. Boone fiddled with the sight on his Winchester, then set it down, then picked it up again. Clarabel cleaned the last of the tools and hung them teeth down, edges wrapped, handles oiled with a whisper of tallow. Order calmed a place. Order made panic feel embarrassed when it tried to show up. Dust rose again, this time heavier, layered, the unmistakable signature of multiple horses traveling with purpose. Clarabel saw it from the barn threshold and did not hurry. She set the oil rag aside, picked up the rifle she had leaned against the wall, and walked to the corral. Boone followed and took his place on the porch step, rifle across his knees, the end of the bell wire within reach of his left hand. 7 riders formed a crescent 20 yards out. Frank in the center as before, Jake to his right with a smile that meant trouble, Tom to his left looking like trouble had begun to taste like ash. The other 4 were the sort of men towns use for stories when they want to warn their sons. Hard hats, narrow eyes, the rest of them filed down to muscle and habit. "Afternoon," Frank called, voice even, as if courtesy could launder intent. "I drew a line," Clarabel said. "You came to test whether it holds." Frank ignored her, or tried to. "Carter, you let your property run its mouth, and now you're in debt to apology." "She's not property," Boone said, standing without thinking about it first. Jake laughed, but the sound broke at the end like a rope under strain. "You count, Carter? 7 to 2? "I counted," Clarabel said. "I also placed water, angles, and witnesses." "Witnesses?" Frank frowned, scanning the empty road. "Neighbors," she said. "They show up quick when cruelty rides loud, quicker when a town decides it won't live by fear." Frank shifted in his saddle. He was used to conversations where numbers ended arguments. This yard had been rewritten since yesterday. Wagon placed a shield, troughs like small walls, a woman standing with a rifle not raised but ready, and a man who sounded like he'd found a spine he didn't remember owning. He hated the way the scene refused to fit the old script. "Here's how this goes," he said, anger thinning into instruction. "You hand her over to our keeping for correction. We ride out easy, or you keep pushing your luck and bad things follow." "Correction is what you needed and never asked for," Clarabel answered. "You're confusing consequence with cruelty because it's the only lesson you studied." Tom's horse sidestepped. Tom steadied him with a distracted hand. His eyes tracked the bell wire, the angle of the wagon tongue, the way the sunlight made shooting into the porch a fool's errand. He lowered his voice toward Frank. "Not clean," he muttered. Jake's right hand hovered near his holster, in a way meant to make other hands jump early. Clarabel didn't oblige him with motion. The stillness she held wasn't defiance for show. It was control for use. Boone matched her quiet, a student of something he should have learned a decade ago. A flicker of movement on the town road caught Frank's attention. The faintest smear of dust where the heat shimmered. Neighbors or mirage? The doubt landed where certainty used to live. "Last chance," he said, though his voice had lost the weight to make it true. "You already had it," Clarabel said. "Yesterday, when you were told no and rode away alive. That was your chance." Silence stretched, thin and dangerous. Somewhere behind them, the heeled bay stamped and blew, impatient with human arithmetic. Boone felt the tug of the bell wire against his fingers, an option measured in sound, not blood. He didn't pull it. The yard already rang with the idea of it. Frank made his choice the way a man sets a bad hand down face down and pretends he meant to fold. "We'll be back with more," he said. "Bring wisdom instead," Clarabel replied. "It weighs less and travels better." They turned their horses because leaving badly is still better than staying to lose. Dust climbed around them like camouflage, and then thinned to nothing. Clarabel lowered her rifle to the crook of her arm. Boone let out a breath he hadn't registered holding. "They'll multiply," he said. "Then so will we," she answered. "Work now, talk after." She pointed to the north fence line, where 3 posts leaned like tired men. "Those before the heat lays us flat. Then we'll set a second bell to the barn." He nodded and moved. The day, having hesitated at the edge of trouble, chose to continue. The troughs stood where she had put them. The bell wire hummed when asked, and the place looked like a thing learning to defend itself without becoming the thing it resisted.
The second plume of dust began as a smudge against heat shimmer and became, with patience, people. Sadie Quinn drove her wagon at the front, reins steady in practiced hands. Beside and behind her rode the blacksmith with forearms like bridge timbers, Dr. Reynolds with his medical satchel lashed tight to his saddle, and 4 others whose livelihoods depended on a town that could look itself in the eye. They took their places not with fanfare, but with the clean geometry of intention, angling between the Wallace men and the Carter porch so that any shot would have to travel through neighbors to hit its mark. Frank Wallace saw the line settle and felt the math go wrong in his bones. He had ridden out to make fear public again, to return the yard to the old order where one man's threat could stand in for law. But the yard had changed, and now the road had too. "This isn't your concern, Sadie," he called, voice pitched to Carrie. "Take your wagon home." When armed men ride onto a neighbor's land making demands, it's every neighbor's concern, Sadie answered. Her posture on the seat was plain and unshakable. "We've come to say so." Clarabel did not move from her place by the corral. The rifle lay easy across her forearms, muzzle lowered, finger nowhere near the trigger. Her gaze swept the crescent of riders, then touched the townsfolk one by one, acknowledging each with a small nod that made private commitment feel like public fact. Boone stood 2 steps in front of the porch post, Winchester down but ready, the bell wire loop resting against the back of his hand as a reminder that sound could still be chosen over blood. Jake's mouth curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Look at this," he drawled. "Carter, the storekeeper's come to hold your hand." "Carter doesn't need me to hold his hand," Sadie said. "He needs the truth held up where everyone can see it." She shifted the reins 1 notch and let the wagon roll half a wheel forward, enough to announce that retreat wasn't the only option a sensible person might make. Dr. Reynolds moved his mare a step up beside her. "Frank," he said, voice level and tired, the way a man's gets when he's repeated himself too often. "Your father believed a man's word meant something. He believed neighbors meant more. Don't make us remember him this way." Tom Wallace tugged at his horse's bit, uneasy. He'd ridden out expecting a small, satisfying spectacle. What he found instead was a community arranging itself like a spine. His gaze flicked from the troughs to the bell wire to the wagon's angle, then to the faces set against him. The blacksmith's calm, the doctor's warning, Sadie's certainty, the ranch hands from the North Place who had learned over a long year that fairness was cheaper than feuds. "Frank," he muttered, not loud, "this isn't wise." Frank ignored him. He kept his attention on Boone and the woman beside the corral, because the story in his head had only two characters, and he meant to force the world back into it. "Carter, hand her over for correction and we'll be gone. You can tell your new friends you made the practical choice." Boone's answer came without the hesitation that had once ruled him. "She isn't mine to hand over," he said, "and this land isn't yours to ride, not like this." Jake's right hand hovered near his pistol, as if gravity itself had shifted. He let it hang there, knowing how often the threat of motion works better than motion. Clarabel's stillness answered him. It drained his gesture of its purpose. Her voice stayed low. "Mr. Wallace, you have a choice. You can leave with what dignity you brought, or you can discover that the town you've underestimated has more ways to stand than you have to push." He laughed, but something cramped the sound on its way out. "You think a handful of shopkeepers scare us?" The blacksmith finally spoke, slow as a hammer falling true. "I don't do scaring. I do building, and, when needed, stopping. Today, I'm here for stopping." A murmur traveled the riders. It wasn't fear, not exactly. More the recognition that the ground had changed underneath their horses' hooves. The hired men in the Wallace line were professionals at weighing odds. The odds were getting heavier in a direction they didn't prefer. One oiled his reins and said nothing. Another settled deeper in the saddle and studied the horizon as if searching for a better idea. Clarabel took one step forward, not aggressive, not timid. The movement placed her shoulder to Boone. From a distance, they would have read as partners before anyone learned their names. "Force is a clumsy teacher," she said. "We've prepared for clumsy. What we require from you is restraint." Frank's jaw worked. He had spent years teaching the county a single lesson. Fear travels faster than fairness. Today, the lesson wasn't taking. Sadie's wagon blocked the road in exactly the place he needed it not to be. The doctor's voice reminded him of a past where his name didn't sour a room. The blacksmith's presence hinted at consequences beyond the hour. And the woman with the rifle, her refusal to be moved by threat did more damage to his authority than a shot fired would have. "This is not finished," he said, but the sentence lacked a destination. "It is," Sadie replied, gentle and absolutely sure. "You just haven't arrived." Tom shifted again, the anxiety in his horse now clearly his own. "Frank," he said louder, "either we do murder in daylight in front of the people who fix our wagons and set our bones, or we go home and rethink. I vote home." For a long beat, the yard held its breath. Wind pushed a thin sound through the cottonwoods. Somewhere in the barn, the bay stamped, sound and impatient. Boone felt the pull of the bell wire on his skin. He did not tug. The choice to leave it quiet was, in its way, the day's first victory. Frank flicked his reins and turned his horse, the motion sullen as a slammed door. "Mount up," he barked, and the men obeyed, because men like them obey the nearest order that lets them keep their faces. Jake lingered one heartbeat longer, eyes locked on Clarabel's, looking for flinch. He found none and looked away first. They rode out under a sky suddenly too large for swagger, dust smearing their outlines, until the road took them entirely. The yard exhaled the breath it had been saving for months. A small, incredulous cheer rose from one of the ranch hands, and died at a look from the blacksmith, who preferred sturdy gratitude to celebration. Dr. Reynolds turned to Boone. "You've got neighbors," he said. "Treat them like it." "I will," Boone answered, and the will felt different in his mouth than it ever had. Less like a threat, more like a promise. Sadie climbed down from the wagon seat, pressed a folded paper into Clarabel's palm. Names, supplies, a rough schedule for folks willing to be present at dusk for the next few days. "We'll rotate," she said. "No need to be brave alone." Clarabel read the paper and tucked it into her apron. "Thank you," she said. "We'll mend fence before sunset, then coffee. Anyone who wants a cup can have one." "Imagine that," Sadie said, half smiling. "A plan that includes coffee." She climbed back to the seat and gathered her reins. "We'll be by tomorrow, whether there's company or not." The town's riders peeled away in pairs, the road long but somehow friendlier for having been used correctly. When the last of them had gone, Boone leaned his rifle against the porch post and sat, elbows on knees, head down. The shape of his quiet had changed. It was not the sulk of a man overlooked. It was the pause of a man reorganizing himself. Clarabel set her rifle inside the shed and came back to the yard with a coil of rope. "North fence," she said. "If the post near the arroyo shifts, the whole line complains." He rose and went with her. Side by side they walked the boundary, tightening, splicing, setting braces where wind and weather had been winning. The bell wire gave a soft whisper when the breeze nudged it. The troughs cast long shadows like short, sturdy walls. This was how a place learned to keep itself, by arranging people and objects into lines of care, by choosing neighbors over noise, and by telling fear it would have to find another yard to roost in. As the sun slid down, the Carter place looked plain and right in the amber light. The day had not been a victory shouted. It had been a decision kept. And in a country where men like Frank Wallace tried to make fear into weather, a kept decision was the better climate. Autumn carried the light differently, warming the Carter place in long, patient strokes that made straight lines look prouder than they had any right to. 3 months had worked their arithmetic across the ranch. Fences stood plumb, the barn roof lay tight as a kept promise, and the corral rails no longer sighed when the wind leaned on them. Grass had returned in cautious green to the patches where hooves had once eaten hope. The heeled bay tossed his head at every morning, sound and showy, and a leggy foal, his, shadowed him around the lot, still uncertain what to do with all 4 feet at once. Clarabel moved through the improved yard as if reading music she knew by heart. A satchel of bottles clinked at her side. Smells of camphor, garlic, pine pitch, and clean rags trailed her steps. Word had traveled the county that a steady hand on the Carter place could turn fever and swelling, pull thorns no one else could find, and calm a creature that had learned to mistrust hands. Wagons came with goats coughing, calves bloated, a mule with an eye filmed over, and left lighter both in worry and coin, neatly recorded on a ledger now as tidy as the tool rack. Boone handled that ledger with a care he had not known he possessed. The pencil no longer hesitated at sums that leaned to the good. He still sat the porch in the evenings, old habits have their rituals, but the bottle lived unopened more often than not, and the quiet gathered around him like a friend rather than a sentence. When he watched Clarabel stitch a split hide or measure out a tincture, something in his face unlearned hardness and relearned attention. Sadie Quinn came often, sometimes with goods and sometimes with nothing but news and laughter to oil the day. On an afternoon with a sky so high it made a person stand taller to meet it, she rolled up with a sack of flour, a bolt of brown cloth, and a look that signaled a story worth hearing.
"Wallace boys pulled stakes last week," she said, setting the sack down with a soft thump. "Rode south where folks don't yet know the shape of their noise." Boone glanced up from the ledger and let the fact settle where it belonged, not as triumph, not as relief exactly, but as a right thing finally choosing to be elsewhere. Clarabel's only reply was a small nod. The work in front of her did not pause. She was packing salves into a tin while a rancher from west of the arroyo waited with a patient heifer and the patience of a man who had discovered he could borrow someone else's. After Sadie and the waiting rancher left, the yard returned to its hum. Chickens stitched gossip into the dust. The foal tested a clumsy buck and surprised himself with altitude. Boone closed the ledger and stepped off the porch with a feeling that had been looking for the right words for weeks. He found them halfway to the corral. "This partnership we've been living," he said, stopping where Clarabel could keep working if she wanted. "It should be on paper, legal, equal." He shortened the rest to the part that mattered. Co-owners. She studied his face the way she would a horse's gait, patient, listening for what the words might be hiding. "Are you certain?" He nodded once, the motion plain and unembellished. "Everything straight here got that way because of what you know and what you're willing to hold against weather and men. If the law doesn't recognize that, then the law should be corrected." He had not always spoken like that. The surprise of it flickered across his features and then settled into certainty. Clarabel considered the offer not as a gift, she had no use for those, but as a naming that matched reality. "Then we will make the paper match the work," she said. Sadie loaned the back room of her store to a traveling attorney 2 days later. The man unrolled documents from a worn case and asked his questions with the air of someone accustomed to making other people's lives agree with ink. Witnesses gathered almost as naturally as dust. The blacksmith leaning in the doorway with clean hands for once, Dr. Reynolds, the 2 North Place ranch hands who had stood in the yard when standing mattered most. The bay's breeder stood by chance at the counter, counted as neighbor too. Clarabel read each line, finger steady under the words, pausing to ask when a phrase tried to wobble. Boone listened and answered when the questions were his. The paper did not confuse what they had built. Equal shares, equal say, equal burden. When the attorney turned the page and held out the pen, Clarabel signed first. Her name took the line in a script that was not fancy, but was firm. A stake in soil that had finally decided to hold. Boone signed beside it. His hand did not tremble. Sadie clapped once, a sound that made the room feel bigger. The blacksmith grinned in small degrees. Dr. Reynolds exhaled as if a patient's fever had broken. Outside, wagons rattled past, children squabbled over a length of blue ribbon, and the town went on with its chores, unaware that something quiet and important had just taken root. Back at the ranch, the paperwork went into a tin box, the tin box into a drawer, and the drawer into a house that would now be measured by a different standard than the one that had nearly ruined it. Clarabel returned to her rounds without ceremony. Ceremony, she had learned, doesn't feed animals or mend roofs. Boone followed her to the corral, not to oversee, but to be near the work that made sense. Evening slid in. The sky picked up color and carried it, gold tipping to ember, ember to a tenderness that makes even the hard edges of a day admit they were worth it. Clarabel rested her arms on the top rail and watched the foal learn to lower his head to the bucket without splashing everything except his mouth. Boone stood beside her, not quite touching, the space between them a comfortable thing instead of a wall. "Do you ever regret the road that brought you here?" he asked, voice low so the question wouldn't startle the moment. She took time before answering, not to search for words, but to weigh which belonged. "Regret belongs to the injustice," she said, "not to the work of turning it. If a thing can be turned, it should be. If people can, they must." The old shackles hung by the shed door, oiled to keep them from flaking themselves into forgetfulness. Visitors saw them and understood that the ranch taught as much as it traded. Assumptions rust when exposed to weather and scrutiny. Fear becomes ridiculous beside cooperation. Domination, in the long run, is a wasteful technology. Occasionally, a traveler would ask why keep the iron if the lesson had taken. Clarabel would answer that some truths serve best as tools left in sight, handy to show and unnecessary to use. Through the open kitchen window came the clink of cups. Coffee steamed on the table, fat and fragrant. The ledger lay open to a page where columns added toward confidence. Outside, the troughs still stood where they made tactical sense, but now they also reflected the sky. The bell wire strung between porch and shed sang once when the breeze found it, a small, bright note that said communication remained an option. Later, when moonlight turned the yard into a silver map, the pair walked the boundary as they had the first week, checking braces, tapping posts, tightening where time had loosened. It looked like maintenance. It felt like stewardship. The night air smelled of cut hay, cooling iron, and the lavender Sadie had tucked into the last sack of flour because good places should carry good smells, too. They stopped at the gate and looked back. The Cotter Ranch didn't look new. It looked right. That difference was the miracle. Stories would grow from this ground, told over stew at harvest, told to children who wanted to hear about the day the town learned the shape of its own courage, told by travelers who liked a tale with a neat hinge where the world turns. In every telling, the chains would seem smaller than the woman who wore them. In every telling, partnership would outlast fear. The gate clicked shut behind them with a sound like punctuation. The night took the period and held it on the page of the valley, clear and dark, and final enough to start the next line in the morning.